So it's interesting being a political scientist, talking about issues of replication, statistical significance, so forth. I was at a meeting at Columbia a couple years ago, and people were talking about, it was like big data meeting. So like the astronomer came up and said, we have petadata and we're analyzing them to answer this question. And then the neuroscientist came up and we have exodata. And each group like coming out and like we have a little bit more data that they're trying to process. Really fascinating problems. And I said, well, as a political scientist, these are people, they have like zillions of data points, and then they have some key question they're trying to answer. And I said, in political science, we have like 2 data points, but zillions of questions we want to answer. And also we can't replicate usually, like to say, well, we need to replicate this study, so we're going to get 10 more wars and 5 more depressions, and the politicians of the world are doing their best to help on that, but it's not about to happen. We just can't replicate things that are. There is experimental political science, like people go to Africa and have people play the dictator game and that crap like that. And there's experimental economics, but most of what we do is observational. Regarding high levels of statistical significance, there's a presidential election every 4 years. So if I want to make a statement about elections with 95% confidence, that would be a statement that's only wrong once out of every 80 years. But in 80 years, there are various regime changes. I wouldn't even expect to have that. So it's not clear that I want 95% confidence or would really know what to do with it at all. So I have a bunch of topics today. See if we get through all of them. Part 1, imagine a world. 2, the piranha principle. 3, worse than Freud. 4, the fallacy of the one-sided bet. 5, social science as we know it is impossible, featuring 16. 6, the vicious cycle and it's our fault. 7, statistics is hard. 8, sane, reasonable, and wrong. 9, workflow and the folk theorem. And 10, taking the lessons of metascience and applying them to science. We'll see what we can do. Imagine a world in which your attitude on immigration could be affected by a subliminal smiley face on a computer screen. A world in which elections were swung by shark attacks. A world in which how you voted depended on the day within your monthly cycle. Imagine a world in which you're trying to hire somebody and who you decide to hire is dependent on how they were standing before they came to your interview. That would be a kind of a horrible world. Now, fortunately, there's no good evidence that we live in such a world. But it's kind of worth reflecting on what that would mean. So most of what we've talked about, when we talk about metascience, replication crisis, all that, the conversation tends to be procedural or statistical. So what could people do? What percentage of people returned our phone calls and shared their data? How could we do statistical significance better or not do it at all? Context-free discussions. So statistics is, in a sense, context-free. Statistics is said to be the science of defaults. It's actually interesting when I talk to physicists who do computational physics. They'll work on one problem for 10 years. They work on really hard problem, basically they build scaffolding, they build an entire machine to solve one problem. In statistics, we tend to work on lots of little problems. And we're always, every time as a statistician we're working on a problem, we're really thinking, how can this method generalize? We never do anything just once in statistics. So it's kind of a different world, and indeed, I think the physicists are often kind of frustrated at what we do because it seems very trivial, but we're trying to get things that work every time or most of the time and can be done by others. Nonetheless, context can matter. If I look at a lot of, well, First, let me say the piranha principle. So one reason that I don't believe that all these effects happen in the world, like elections determined simultaneously by shark attacks, subliminal messages, what time of the month it is, anything else that's been published in psychological science during the past week, whatever. One reason I don't believe all these things is I don't think all these effects can't exist at once. In fact, if you believe all these studies, like any of them could be invalidated because maybe the people in the study were being primed by the instructions on the study. Right? Not to mention, there might have been a shark attack last week. There are so many things that could be happening that could be affecting everything else. So the piranha principle is by analogy to if you go to the fish store and you see a fish tank with 10 piranhas swimming around. You don't see that, right? There's going to be at most one piranha left in that fish tank, right? And similarly, there's not really room for all these large effects. It is something we can maybe express mathematically using correlations. But again, that's a methodological point. I want to make a substantive point. The stories, it's interesting to me to think of what are these false, I want to say false theories, these theories for which there is no evidence that have been promoted. They often seem to have a common flavor to them, at least in political science and psychology and economics, which is that our behaviors are manipulable by irrelevant factors. So it's not merely that. So sometimes people talk about the butterfly effect, that the butterfly flapping its wings can do something to somebody over here. The theory is not that. It's that the butterfly flapping its wings can have large and consistent effects. And that's the thing and so in one sense, okay, it doesn't make a lot of scientific sense. I would say it's worse than Freud, because Freud said that there are large and consistent, there are large effects from things like sex drive, resenting your parents, fear of death, like kind of big things in life. I actually believe that these things do affect us in a lot of complicated ways. Then Freud was criticized because his theories are in many ways unfalsifiable, because these deep things can affect you in different ways. But I think that's actually right. In contrast, a lot of these other theories have this, how do you say, like push a button, take a pill model of science, right? So this idea that everything is like, you do this and this other thing will happen. So again, that's methodological, but I feel like there are also political implications, because if this is true, if our economic and political attitudes and decisions are really being driven by irrelevant factors, like the time of the month, right? If that were really the case, then I don't think we should take voters very seriously, because voters are kind of silly people. It's a kind of fundamentally anti-democratic attitude. It's an attitude that you might like if you want to get like funding from advertising companies, but I don't see it as, it's scary. That's what I said. It's a scary thought. And I think that when we talk about replication crisis and so forth, I would say not replication crisis. To me, it's a crisis of potential replication. So a lot of these studies, like the study that claimed that more beautiful parents were more likely to have girls than boys, you don't need to replicate it to realize it has a problem. This is related to what Steve Goodman was saying. You can work it out mathematically that these studies are just pure noise. But sometimes it's the threat of replication that's more necessary than actually replicating. And again, in political science, we can't really replicate very much anyway. But if these claims were true, they would have very important implications about politics. And what scares me a little bit is that a lot of people do think these claims are true or act as if these claims are true. And then I think it's natural for them to be kind of anti-democratic a little bit. So if I wanted to make a big picture, I would say that the open science movement is, of course, very democratic in how it's, in many ways, in how it's organized or disorganized. And that pleases me in the sense that the substantive claims that are being refuted often really happen to be very anti-democratic. And a lot of this, I just feel like often researchers who write about this or journalists, they just always put themselves in the position of the people in charge. You know, like, I'm gonna nudge you and get you to do what I want. Like, no one's ever like, you know, I don't wanna get nudged, right? Or like, it's like, you know, like, yeah, I'm gonna do this little one quick trick and then I'm gonna get a job. Well, that's awesome, right? You're manipulating somebody into hiring you. Super cool. Not, okay? So I don't like that. I mean, I just, as I said, if it's true, it's true. If you could really manipulate people like that, it's good for us to know, okay? But it's scary as hell to me that it's often being presented as, isn't this great? We can get people to do what we can manipulate people, we can do what they want. That's scary, you know? So the fallacy of the one-sided bet. So I think you've heard about this Pascal's wager. So Pascal supposedly said you should believe in God because if there is a God, you'll have eternal bliss. And if there's no God, like no loss, no harm, no foul. And as many people have pointed out, that excludes the possibility that maybe there's a God who just does not respect people who believe in him. And maybe if you believe in God, you're going to hell because it's like, and it's only the people who don't believe in God that are going to heaven as a reward for their skepticism. Now, I get emails from people a lot who say, can you help me out? My advisor wants me to do blah, 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 and I feel like it's unethical, but I don't know what to say about it. For real, I get this a lot. And I have a response that I always, not a form letter, but I have an automatic response. I always say, well, there's some procedure they want you to do and you think it's wrong. What you have to do is kind of role play it. So when your advisor talks to you, then you say, well, this sounds great, but I'm a little worried about, like, what if reviewer number 2 sees this and says, well, but isn't this wrong, blah, 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 blah. This might make us look bad, don't you think? So you can kind of play that role there, right? Like you can do that. Now, I think the fallacy of the one-sided bet comes up in a lot of discussions. Okay, for example, early childhood intervention. So there's various studies of programs for helping little kids. Then economists follow them up. Follow the kids up decades later. There was one study a few years ago where there was an early childhood intervention program in Jamaica, and they followed it up. The kids who had the intervention had 40, I think it was 42% higher earnings than the kids who didn't have the intervention, and it was statistically significant. I think the 95% interval went from 2 to 82, because like 42 is right in the middle. I think that estimate's a little bit too high. Now, a lot of these things, like I brought up that example because this may be a little bit more important than some of the other silly examples we've talked about. But I think sometimes when we criticize these, I mean, I'm bothered by some of the talks at this conference because I feel like people are a little bit too polite, or like too ready to like give some bad research the benefit of the doubt and say, well, you know, we tried everything. It was something like, we tried everything. They still didn't cooperate, but we bent over backwards to try to find results. And I've seen this, like, people published like that replication paper. I think when it came out, the many labs or whatever, there's something like, well, there could be a million reasons why these new results differ from the old results. Of course, one reason is the old results were no good, right? But we're not supposed to say that. But, you know, like, because then people say, well, what if this thing really works, right? Wouldn't you feel terrible? But a lot of these, if someone publishes a paper and they say a certain intervention has a positive effect, what do I think? I don't think it has a null effect. I think people almost never study things with null effects. I mean, occasionally they do, but that's rare. What I think is these effects depend on context, and they're positive for some people and negative for other people. It varies. You know, if you don't criticize it, it's possible that you're like promoting something that's harmful. Well, everybody knows that with like drug development, but it's true of like, economic interventions too, and psychology interventions. All these things have opportunity costs. I'm not saying I don't have a stake in early childhood intervention. Like, it seems like a good idea to me, but it's not necessarily better than the alternative. Don't forget, things are compared to the control. So people are already doing their best. So it's not clear that these are always the best uses of resources. And I think there is a tendency for us by default to assume goodwill on goodwill of the experimenters, to assume that any intervention being considered is going to be positive. But I think we maybe shouldn't make that assumption. I'm not saying we should think people are trying to hurt you, but I'm just saying we shouldn't necessarily. I think I would start my prior at 0. I wouldn't start my prior by saying something is good and I need extraordinary evidence to shoot something down. Right? So this is it's interesting, like people send me papers all the time to look at, and sometimes I can just say well, I don't know, I'm not convinced by this. Like, I don't need to give a good reason why I'm not convinced. I'm just not convinced. It's not my job to, I don't owe the author of a paper just because they published it in a journal. I don't owe them belief. Not at all. I don't. I mean, I don't need to, and it's one way of thinking about this is the scientific review process, that we can, if you're a referee on a paper, you can shoot down a paper by saying, well, their identification strategy was not convincing. It was weak, right? There is a problem here. There are potential differences between the two groups that weren't addressed in the paper. Once it's published, if you want to criticize it, you're supposed to not only say that there's a potential problem, you're supposed to prove that that was a problem, that the default has shifted. But again, the fallacy of the one-sided bet, shifting that default can create problems. So I am not giving in one step on that one. I really think we have to be careful. It's good to be polite and all that, but we're not, the ultimate goal of the goal of Metascience is science, not scientists, right? I mean, and we don't owe somebody something just because they published a paper. Or there was something else, someone said, well, this is so unfair, someone publishes a paper and it turns out it's wrong, and then it gets retracted and it hurts their career. It's oh, that's terrible, it hurts their career. Of course, I don't want my career to be hurt either. I've had to retract papers, it happens all the time. I've had 4 papers I've had to run corrections because they were wrong. It should hurt my career a little bit, because it helped my career that I got them published, right? So of course it should hurt a little. Now you can argue that it shouldn't hurt as much. You can make arguments about what the relative pluses and minuses are of this. I was told in mathematics what's important is not the number of true theorems you've proved minus the number of false theorems you've proved. It's just the number of true theorems you've proved. Okay, Cauchy is Cauchy. If it turned out that he proved 18 false theorems, who cares? Newton was an alchemist, who cares, right? I proved 2 theorems and 1 was false, but it doesn't. My score is not 0. It's 1. Okay. So social science as we know it is impossible, featuring 16. Well, this is really what Steve Goodman said, that we do studies that we can barely measure what we need to measure. If we say you can barely get statistical significance, or if you want to use some other framework, you can really barely be sure that your results would replicate even on the average. But really, we care about subgroups. That's clear in psychology. Everything is about interactions, but it's also true in policy analysis. Because again, people are already doing the best they can. There's almost never a policy that just comes out compared to nothing. The policies are going to be, you want to do them where they're cost effective and where they're better than the alternative. You don't want to do them otherwise. There's almost nothing that works for everybody, because if it worked for everybody, you'd already be doing it. I mean, not always, but typically. So we care about interactions. But remember 16, you need 16 times the sample size to estimate an interaction as you do to estimate a main effect. That's just a little bit of math. And well, whether or not our studies are adequately powered, we certainly don't have a spare factor of 16 kicking around. So what we care about, we cannot measure to the certainty that we want. I don't have time to explain all those numbers, but this is kind of a key point, is that we're expecting a level of certainty that's not realistic anyway, but certainly not for the interactions that we care about. So I'm going to get back to that at the end. So social science as we know it is impossible. I don't think we should do no social science. I think we should, but I think there are three things that we could do better, and I'll talk about that. So the vicious cycle, and it's our fault. So what is the vicious? Well, what I mean, this is true. If you ever want, we tell this to our students. So suppose you're giving a talk somewhere, you're about your research, and you say, I did this great thing. We have this great method. We made this great discovery. You always have to explain, if it's such a great idea, why nobody did it already. You have to have a reason. Now, your reason, it could be technological. Like, oh, the reason is we built this, awesome new microscope so we can see things that nobody could see before, right? Or we used a new set of data, we used some awesome new intrusive set of data, from Uber or whatever. So like we know where everybody's butt is at every time, and like, whatever it is. Like you have new data, you have a new method. We have a brilliant idea. We had this new, someone came up with we have a new survey question. There are different things like that. Like, and I've done that. Like I'll say I have we use Stan and we can fit models we couldn't fit before. We did surveys asking how many people do you know, so you can learn about other people not in the same. There's a lot of things you can do like that. But you have to have a reason why what you did, why the previous people got it wrong. And usually the reason is not that the previous people were idiots, right? That's not usually what you're allowed to say. Right? So what went wrong? So when I say the vicious cycle, this is like related to theoretical work that people have done and how bad science can persist. Now, some of this is just kind of sociological. Journals publish bad results, and then they don't want to give up on them, so forth. Some of it's statistical also. So people do studies, and they have big standard errors. So the estimates are really large, because they have to be large to be statistically significant. Then they have these large estimates, and people follow up, and they think they need 80% power. They compute the power of their method based on these large overestimates. So then they do a study and they think they're going to succeed because they have 80% power. And then they succeed. They find a way to succeed because that's their expectation. One thing I found very refreshing about Adam's talk this morning was that he wants to fail. He expects failure. So if you expect failure, I expect failure too. If you expect failure, you're in better shape. And I don't just mean like you're in better shape because when you succeed, you're happy, whatever, but you're not intellectually committed to something that's not going to happen. So let's suppose you do a series of studies and your true power in these studies is 5.1%. That's realistic. But you think it's 80%. And then you do a bunch of studies and you find only about a third of them are success. This is probably realistic for a lot of scientists. So first you feel only a third are a success. Well, sure, because the 80% power is only approximate. You feel like you've paid your dues, right? You've already done all these failed studies, but actually you're not. You're actually maybe finding patterns that aren't there because things are so noisy. But you can persist in this vicious cycle. Now, why is it our fault? When I say our fault, I mean the fault of statisticians. There are so many ways that statistical theory has failed us. Maybe like the largest is this idea of certainty. So statistics is like a method for laundering uncertainty laundering. Now, sometimes that works. Like Las Vegas is all about, well, they do money laundering there too, apparently, but they do uncertainty laundering, right? So you come in, you have a million people come in and play roulette, and each time they could win or lose, but you average them out, and the casino owner's just going to win, right? But that only works because it's probability theory, because you know the probabilities. It doesn't work out. It doesn't work more generally. But if you look at statistics books, including my own, we just have lots of examples where people have data and then they get these very strong conclusions. So we've demonstrated this, so we're teaching people that that's what statistics does. And so it's hard for me to, like, I get frustrated. Let's say like some psychologist writes a paper and they have some, their p-values, their t-statistic is like 5.03, and someone recalculates, it turns out they messed up and it was really 1.8. Right? And then the person who does the wrong analysis gets angry, they start attacking their critics, they say it didn't matter anyway. And I'm like, well, if it didn't matter, why did you put the damn 5.03 in your paper in the first place? If it didn't matter, like, why do you do that? Why are people always giving this statistical significance? It's so meaningless. They're not doing it because they want to, they're doing it because statisticians made them do it. So then I go and say, don't do this statistical significance. And they're like, you're saying that, but just the other day a statistician made me do it. And I'm like, I'm a different person. I'm not like, but from their point of view, we're all statistics, right? It would be like, if you got in the airlines, like the Delta ticket counter person says you can't take this bag on the plane, and then the stewardess says you can. You don't say, well, they all work for Delta, right? So like we all work for statistics. And we've been doing bad stuff in that way. Also, we've been encouraging this context-free approach, right? If you look at statistics textbooks, I remember when I took a class in statistics, the professor told me triumphantly that you can test whether an intervention works and estimates its effect without understanding how it works at all, right? Do a randomized experiment. Okay, that's false, actually, because first, all you could possibly get is the average treatment effect. Usually you care about the individual. So first, he was sleight of hand, right? He was like, look, you can estimate the average treatment effect and you don't need to make any assumptions, blah, 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 blah. Really cool, really cool. You don't need to know anything. It's like, well, but way at the beginning, he said the average treatment effect. That's not what I want, actually. So yeah, you can, it's defined as the thing you can estimate. Well, that's important math. It's good to know that, right? But it's misleading at the same time. So we teach a context-free mode of science. Now, why is that a problem, the context-free mode of science? Why is that a statistical problem? Well, for a bunch of reasons. Okay, so it's related to, how do I say this? Okay, so the attitude is if you've discovered something statistical significant, it's real, and then you can worry later about what it means. So I was having some discussion with some people who did a study claiming that what time of your monthly cycle it was affected like how you vote and what clothing you wear. And at one point, I realized that they had used the wrong dates of the monthly cycle. Like they said the dates of peak fertility were days 6 to 14. It's really 10 to 17. I happen to know that because I'm middle-aged, and when we were in our 40s, we were trying to have another kid. And so you learn what are the days of peak fertility. But like young researchers, they might not know. They just, I'm not kidding. So it's like, well, what happened? You got the days wrong. Well, it doesn't matter. We discovered something. So it wasn't about peak fertility. It was actually about the days before peak fertility. So it's still a discovery, right? That's what's important. Well, this is a problem, the paradigm of routine discovery. It's a bunch of phrases I don't like. False discovery rate, I don't like that. This idea you're making discoveries all the time, it's ridiculous. Or this false positive thing, everything's happening. There's no false positives, there aren't zeros out there. I'm not worried about false positives. I'm worried about people making bad decisions. That's a little bit different. But here's the deal, that I think to do better, so I'll skip a few things. I won't get to talk about workflow and the folk theorem, and I won't get to talk about sane, reasonable, and boring, and wrong, I mean. I'll have to talk about taking the lessons of metascience and applying them to science. But first, I want to say one thing about statistics is hard. Okay, we talk a lot about incentives. People do bad statistics even when they have all the right incentives. Because like they're fighting wars, they're trying to make money, they have the incentives. Statistics is still hard. You can see a lot of statistical mistakes by people who have every incentive to get it right. I mean, it's worse when you don't have the incentives. But so how would I take the lessons of metascience and apply them to science? I think we need to take better measurements. I think that's the big thing. And I think we have to the context-free approach is really problematic. And it bothered me about a lot of these talks even though I agreed with mostly what people were saying, I don't think that you can't you can't solve problems in any particular scientific area by getting larger sample sizes or any of these things alone. I think you really need to be measuring things much more directly. I think we have to think a lot more about what we're actually studying in any given scientific field. So that's meta-science for you. I think we have to think more about science sometimes, and meta-science can maybe help us with that.
Okay, so I just comment. I really admire what you said about the no need to be polite in the matters that we discussed. And to me, an example is that in the 19th century, this Oliver Wendell Holmes, he published this review where he summarized the evidence that childbed fever, which was nearly universally lethal, is infectious. And it was a very contentious issue, and obviously women continued to die. And he republished it some years later, trying to convince them finally. And he said that nobody will argue with me at the deathbed of a mother holding a dead child next to her. So, I mean, it may be but it's not an exaggeration to say that what we are trying to understand, look, from my perspective as cancer researcher, is say the study which finds that only 6 out of 53 studies is correct, it's difficult to explain way to say a cancer patient as something that is, can be analyzed only, as you said, by formulas and everything else. And this is why when I read a study which says, well, there is no replication crisis, or there is no problem in science, and I see that this piece of information is missing from there, the study 6 of 53. I'm just wondering why. So I really, again, admire you bringing it up. And maybe I'm just cynical and impolite, but we need to decrease this politeness in the audience because we are talking about really life and death.
I'll try to be less polite in the future. I think that I think that one thing is that there needs to be more of an integration of data analysis with the ideas being studied and tested. And so right now there's often a disconnect where someone's supposed to come up with an idea and then having come up. So if you come up, like in medical research, you come up with an idea and then you're going to test it, you need to not only come up with the idea, but figure out what flavor of treatment to do, which is really like estimating an interaction, but without maybe having the data to do that. So I think there probably needs to be more of an integration of data analysis with modeling, which of course people do in applied worlds.
Hi, Leif Nelson, psychologist from UC Berkeley. First, thanks for this talk, and thank you in general for speaking about statistics in a way that makes them seem practical and meaningful. That's an authentic compliment. And so now I'm going to ask a question that I think is actually just clarification. You speak a lot about how we're studying things in like a context-free way, and I would have said that as a social psychologist, that language sounds a lot like what translates into concerns about hidden moderators, which is a term you might have heard before, where they say, oh, the reason that you're unable to replicate our effect is because you're missing some of the key contextual features. And in that world, and I could picture that person even appealing to, well, Gelman says that we're not taking in sufficient account of these hidden moderators. He says that failures to replicate are just because we're not paying attention to context. Am I getting your position right or the argument right? I'm just looking for clarification.
Oh, well, I guess I I think the term failure to replicate, I've used it too, but it's a little bit misleading because it's treating replication as some sort of discrete thing. But I think just for simple mathematical reasons, we won't expect to see new things in a new study. So if someone publishes a paper and there's been a lot of selection of the data and what they present, then of course you won't expect to see that next time. I mean, there are lots of talks earlier. Even in the absence of any moderators or anything else, you're still not going to see that, expect to see that. But I guess the hidden moderators and all that will just make things worse.
Hi, John Protzko, Psychology, UC Santa Barbara. I'm curious about your piranha principle that you mentioned sort of at first. I really like the examples. So I believe in them, as in they may not be real. But when we move away from human behavior and thought and the mind, everything is multiply determined. There's not one cause of a plant growing. Everything has a number of causes over and over and over again. And it seems like you were suggesting in the piranha principle that once we start getting into humans, it's not the case. There can't be 100 different small causes moving us all around. So could you clarify that, please?
Yeah, the piranhas are supposed to represent large and consistent effects. You can have 100 different small effects. Obviously, we're all different heights, right? We have different small effects. Our behaviors are affected by lots of things. My issue was having a lot of large and consistent effects. Once you accept that the effects can vary based on context, can be positive. If social priming exists, but sometimes it makes you walk slower and sometimes it makes you walk faster, like that's kind of okay. It's the consistency. And so let me also give a very quick story of something that happened recently when I was talking with some people who work with a pharmaceutical company. They have a bunch of different versions of a drug that they're testing out, and they have to decide which version to take to I think it's called the phase 3 trial, their next phase. And so before doing that, they're doing a little experiment on, I think 32 patients are getting each of 8 different options, and they're going to pick the winner. And so I helped them do a simulation study based on fake data to see what would happen if you simulate data from 32 people. And what you find is that, or 32 on each treatment, what you find is a lot of noise. So if you simulate data and you know the truth, often it's not the winner or even number 2 that gets to the next thing. So my point of that was to try to convince them not to simply use a purely empirical, how many people's lesions go away in the sample to decide what to pursue the next time. I was trying to convince them to use a more fully Bayesian approach and use more intermediate measures. So there are ways in which there's a metascience principle, which is don't believe what you get from a small sample, but there's also a statistical principle how you can learn more. So accepting uncertainty is not just a matter of saying, hey, let's just be loose and not believe anything. If you have to make a decision, then knowing you have to accept uncertainty can affect the way you make the decision and hopefully help you make it better. Now it's your turn.
Psychology, UC Davis. I had a thought about the politeness problem, a potential solution, which is also something you brought up. So when we're reviewing or editing or in a position to evaluate or critique a paper and there's some flaws or some suboptimal practices, we might feel impolite pointing them out. But one solution might be to imagine that you're a reviewer too, and that there's some co-authors on the paper, one of whom was a graduate student who emailed you and said, my advisor made me do this thing, but I think it's wrong. And then they're like, well, and then you tell them to go to their advisor, and they go to their advisor, and they say, well, reviewer 2 might point this out. And let's say they lose that fight. They submit the paper, you're the reviewer. By pointing out the suboptimal practices, by pointing out the flaws or the exaggerations or things like that, you might actually be helping to support the early career researcher who lost that battle, who's a co-author on the paper. So if you feel impolite, making those valid criticisms, maybe one way to get over that feeling is to imagine that there might be an early career researcher on the paper who's counting on you to stand up for them.
I like that. You know, there's something really funny because we all know, like other people, when someone points out mistakes in their paper, they should admit it, right? And try to do better. And it's the same with me. If someone points out a mistake in my published papers, I will look and I will feel bad and I'll try to fix it, like for reals, okay? But think about most of the time in science, and especially like you're a graduate student, you're learning how to science, right? Most of the time you're handling criticism is because a paper got submitted and you get the review reports. And sometimes you get really long review reports. Now, I don't know about you, But when I get these review reports, my number one thought is how to dodge these things and get the paper published. Sometimes, though, I have other thoughts, like I'm irritated at the reviewer. It's like that, right? That's about, or I think I didn't express myself clearly. Now, it's very, very rare that I get a review report and I see a comment and I say, oh yeah, I was wrong. I shouldn't have done this. This was a mistake. Like, it's like, unless it's a very tiny technical thing. Like, how often does someone get a review report and they say, oh yeah, this was a bad idea, your study was too noisy, it's junk, and you're like, oh yeah, good point, thanks. And you go, so we train our graduate students to handle criticism in like the worst possible way. This is apprenticeship. How do I train my graduate students to handle criticism? Well, I train them by these review reports. Oh, the review report came in. Oh yeah, let's deal with this comment, this comment, this comment. Like every once in a while we take it seriously, but it's quite a shallow thing. So there's a huge tradition in this review process of just not taking reviews, like not taking criticism seriously at all. So in that sense, it's no surprise that people are so horrible. Right?
We taught them to be horrible. So since we have 2 minutes left, I thought it might be helpful if you wish to do this. I think people would enjoy hearing the shark attack story, because really good people made the initial claim about shark attacks, and then it's been revisited. And Neil Malhotra's here in case you would want him to help with the story, but feel free if you want to.
Oh, the shark attacks? Oh, well, there were a couple of political scientists wrote a paper, actually it was unpublished for many years, claiming that the 1916 presidential election, when Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election, was determined by shark attacks off the Jersey Shore, because New Jersey was a swing state and it was a close election, and I think their phrase was blind retrospection, and so the claim was that there was no logical reason why voters should punish the incumbent president for a shark attack, because like there wasn't like there's some history there, right? Like there was no like law that got passed, you know, like anything to do with that, but that they were just in a bad mood, so they decided to do that. And I just don't remember the details, but they compared certain parts, counties or city towns in New Jersey to other towns and claimed that there was a difference attributed to the shark attacks. But then some other researchers kind of followed up and found that there are other differences between these towns besides whether there was a shark or not, so they cast doubt. So I don't really think there's any evidence that the shark attacks really mattered, but I think that the kind of larger point was that this was placed in a larger context, which is that voters are stupid and vote based on the wrong things. And that's comforting, I think, both to people on the left and to the right, like the idea that voters don't know what they're doing. And I think I'm more in the mainstream of political science, and the mainstream of political science is that voters are voting for what they consider to be good reasons, like who's going to be good for the economy, keep the country safe, stuff like that. And so it does have political implications. That's the shark story.
Thank you very much.